We are very happy as DSCI in collaboration with Microsoft and Greyhound Media to hold this first privacy meet, India Privacy Meet. There have been several discussions at various levels actually that have been engaged, that have been created by us also, but then we want to raise it to a different level where industry can engage more effectively and the government can also participate. We wanted to actually have somebody else be the keynote speaker. In fact, Justice Shah, who is chairing the committee set up by the Planning Commission, but then he was earlier in China and then some other commitment that he had, so he's not been able to make it. So you'll have to accept me as the keynote speaker, although I'm one of the co-organizers. So let me start the introduction which has been made already in terms of privacy. But on first point, which I'd like to bring to your notice is the Facebook, which is Microsoft event, but let me start with Facebook. Facebook tried to raise several $1 billion in the biggest ever IPO by an internet company ever. And this was, as you know, in January. In fact, the IPO was opened on the Data Privacy Day, 28th January, the day we were holding an event along with Baljinder at EXL. Now, what is it that they are cashing in on? That is the powers of the engine of internet commerce, which is personal data that you have alluded to already. So they've been collecting data for 7 years and compiling the information that is freely shared by its 800 million users, 800 million plus now. And they're trying to leverage this commodity to lure advertisers. Now we have seen the kind of fiasco they have gone through, so I will not comment on that. But essentially that personal information is a commodity, is a tradable commodity, which has emerged and people are trying to, companies are trying to see how they can leverage it. But then, how will it handle privacy concerns raised by its users and government regulators worldwide? And we have seen a lot of it over the last couple of months. And it is another story whether investors still believe there is money to be made from the social web. So that is something we will get to know as it unfolds over the next few months. But one point I would like to now get on to, if you have seen today's newspapers, that today is Statistics Day in India. And what is the relevance of that? I'll come towards the end of my my talk. But let me start with what are the concerns today about privacy or privacy. Western's definition of individuals wanting to control dissemination of their personal information. It's a big definition, but the essence is Alan Weston, Columbia professor, 1967, he defined. So individuals want to control dissemination of their personal information. Now I think this is much more relevant today than it was in 1967 when he wrote the book, because technology was just not there. And today the technology is very invasive and very pervasive. And all these technologies are collecting personal information without the knowledge of users. Now, the concerns about this and what has happened, the privacy laws are getting revised, starting with the European Union, which started consultations with stakeholders in July 2009. They came out with a paper, A Comprehensive Approach on Personal Data Protection in the European Union. And this, after massive consultation across the European Union with all kinds of stakeholders and other governments around the world, they have now announced their privacy regulation, and they call it regulation, in January 2012, this year. Again, on 25th January, they announced this one. By regulation, they mean that the European individual nations will not have to enact laws. So as a regulation, it will be applicable across all the countries, unlike the directive which is currently in force since 1995. So based on the directive as a model directive, every nation in European Union has had to enact their own laws. And now with the regulation, they will not have to, although the process is still very long. But then let's now move on to the United States. What have they done in the wake of changing technologies? FTC as well as the Department of Commerce, they came out with papers in the month of December 2010, coincidentally in the same month, and they were opened up for discussion. And in fact, the green papers are also based on a number of discussions with all kinds of stakeholders. And the reports, the titles, for example, might be of interest. Protecting Consumer Privacy in an Era of Rapid Change, a Proposed Framework for Business and Policymakers. And the secondly, Commercial Data Privacy and Innovation in the Internet Policy, a Dynamic Policy Framework. This was in December 2010. And thereafter, again, two years of consultation. In February 2012, White House came out with what they call as Consumer Bill of Rights, which they are now asking the Congress to pass it into law. So the process is still underway. And likewise, the other third bigger player, in fact, which was the main key player which started privacy debate or privacy guidelines, that was OECD in 1980. So OECD is now currently engaged in a similar discussion since 2010, when it celebrated 30 years of OECD guidelines on privacy principles and trans-border data flows. There is a privacy volunteer group comprised of people from around the world, which is now trying to look at the privacy principles, whether they still stand the test of changing technology and globalization. So they are likely to come up with a revised guidelines, I think in the next 6 to 12 months. I happen to be a part of that volunteer group also. And having said this, from around the world, where do we stand as India? The Indian economy is going the electronic way, and privacy is a major concern now, and efforts are underway to have a privacy law enacted in the country, to which I will refer to later. I have Sunil Ibrahim also sitting here, who is a part of the group that we are working together in trying to shape not the law, but to create a framework on which the law should be actually based. Interestingly, there is no generally accepted definition of the term privacy or privacy. Nobody has tried to define it, or they cannot define it. It's used in a very broad sense to refer to protection of an individual's personal sphere. Now, if we want to look at or try to appreciate what is privacy today, we have to go back to the first concerns that were raised in society. And that was in the United States, when printing technology was invented in the 1890s. So printing technology was, they were writing about well-known people and so on. So their privacy was getting impacted. At that time, there was a famous judgment given by Warren and Brandeis in 1890s, right to be let alone. So individual has a right to be let alone in the society. That is what his privacy should be protected. And thereafter, the next wave of technologies, if you will, was the first wave I would like to define in 1960s, when large central databases in which individuals could be tracked, they were created. Essentially, the cupboards full of paper data converted into central databases in the computer. But then, of course, tracking was a little easier. And then the second wave in 80s, when computers were connected over the networks. So multiple databases could be correlated to profile an individual. That was the second wave of technology. So many databases, and you could track an individual across multiple databases. And the third wave, which currently is underway, starting in 2000s, the individual starts generating data actively. The individual is no longer a passive subject about whom data is stored in the computer systems. An individual is now willingly trying to participate, generate data actively, is willing to share in Facebook, Twitter, any of the media, in the hope that he will get back services which are valuable. So he's trying to see that the information he's putting out is willing to trade that and get in return services, free services or whatever it may be. We can all enumerate, starting with the free email and many other things which are happening now. So the landscape since 1980s has changed dramatically. So more organized efforts to invade privacy through new technologies and new practices, facial recognition, geolocation, behavioral advertising, and many others. So vast amounts of personal data about consumers collected and used by retailers, advertisers, search engines, data brokers, lenders, employers. The list is endless. So all kinds of data brokers have emerged in the marketplace. And global data flows today are no longer the result of a file transfer that was initiated by an individual's action for point-to-point transfer decades ago. Somebody had to take an action. But today, when a transaction is initiated on the internet, multiple data flows take place simultaneously. We all know that. So data suddenly is dispersed into multiple locations, multiple centers, and multiple countries all over the world. So once created, it is very difficult to really take it back. And I'll come to what the Europeans are trying to do now, whether they can actually succeed in that. So there's increased globalization of the world economy, growing economic importance of data processing, and as I said, ubiquity of data transfers over the internet, and greater direct involvement of individuals in trans-border data flows, and growing risk to privacy of individuals is the actual result. So this is what has happened over the last 30 odd years, since 1980s. So personal information, economic value, personal information collected from social networks, surveillance technologies like cameras, scanners, RFID tokens, mobile GPS can be used for pervasive surveillance online as well as in the physical world. Now these are, it is like Orwellian fear which comes alive, and some of this is quite right in terms of understandability from the civil society perspective. So what would actually should be the response of the governments is something we will see. But then the key point is, what can be the reasonable expectation of privacy with pervasive technology? So on the part of the individual, should he be worried about privacy all the time? That is, when I go to the network and do something, should I be worried about privacy all the time? I cannot live. It's like walking on the road and you are worried about getting into an accident. So will you stop walking on the road? So the kind of things which are now happening, whether the services, I mean, I'll come to just one point specifically in the context of individual. Notice and choice, are they enough that a website or a service provider has given me notice and given me the option of choice, but then that choice actually does not exist? If you don't agree, then the service will not be provided. And in a way, the government is also trying to do that in multiple projects. So although registration is voluntary, but then if you don't, then you can be denied of the legitimate services that you are entitled to. So privacy has to do with fairness, but then is this approach fair? Should consumers be activists about their privacy all the time? Coming to the government now, we all know that governments always use aggregated data. They can aggregate from multiple locations, and they have a right to do so under many situations. So what is the legal and policy response to this? Since state has the power to get any data from citizens and the private sector, it can be used for any purpose whatsoever. Even the European Union Data Protection Regulation, or the current incarnation directive, states exemptions very clearly, that the following are the exemptions under which the privacy will not be applicable. And OECD guidelines also provide for these kind of exceptions. So if India makes a law giving all this list of exceptions, they are very much within their rights to define that. So we are talking about UID, NatGrid and so on, but they probably can fall under the exceptions. Citizens expect governments to be more transparent, for example, through privacy impact assessment of departments and making them public. Now these are new concepts which we will have to create in the country, that at least they will have to do impact assessments and tell the citizens as to how they are impacted. And also we know that the software has advanced dramatically. Analytics have come into being. You correlate data from multiple sources. In fact, there was a project in University of Southern California where simply by knowing my age group, gender and zip code, from the anonymized data they could trace it back to me as an individual and identify that particular person. So while the analytics are advancing for benign use such as security, public service, research, and of course we understand that there is an ethical dimension to that also in terms of legal framework, public demand, self-regulation, ethical standards. But we have seen many such cases coming to the fore, whether it is Google or others. So law, policy, technology, and public expectation. Now they become the key sort of roles, key sort of regulations. How do we reconcile and synergize? And we see the emergence of accountability principle, and this word accountability is getting defined and redefined and redefined. And one or two things I'll touch upon. But before that, let me just take you through the privacy principles which are being proposed under the EU regulation of January 2012. It's relevant because a similar debate is emerging from the US and probably is of much relevance to India as we evolve our own privacy law. They are talking about more explicit expression of the data minimization principle, although we can relate it to collection limitation, accountability of data controllers by requiring that personal data be processed under the responsibility and liability of the controller, right to object by the data subject for sending of direct marketing, expanding the definition of sensitive data, right to be forgotten and to erasure. Now this is something, as I said, the moment you do a transaction on the internet and there are global data flows around the world, so if you want that the particular source which collected your data to erase it, it just cannot happen. In terms of technology, it is not possible, and the way the whole system is organized, data just travels all over. So even if you make it as a law, right to be forgotten, can you actually implement it? So should we not be debating something which is doable? So that is something that we are also trying to look at in our own country. Then right to data portability, and of course regulating the use of profiling. Profiling, as I said, has been around since 1980s with the correlation of multiple databases on a unique ID. And tomorrow when we have UID numbers with everyone, so there's a possibility of profiling of individual across multiple databases. So while technology is there, applications will develop. So this can be prevented only if there are adequate safeguards in the form of privacy law. Data controllers subjected to wide-ranging data security obligations, data breach notification requirement, data protection impact assessments, and of course something which is again debatable, whether organizations should have data protection officers, which the regulation is trying to mandate for a company beyond the size of 250 people, like CISOs and so on. And they also talk about regulation through drafting of codes of conduct covering various data protection sectors. Like IT BPO sector, if DSCI drafts the code of conduct, it can be approved by the controller, or not the controller, but data protection commissioner or authority, whatever name you provide. And then the actual implementation could be through the self-regulatory authority. So these are some of the salient features of what the Europe is trying to look at, and it is not too distant a future. If the law goes through, it will be implemented in January 2015. So they are still 2 years away, 2.5 years away from that. Coming to the US Consumer Bill of Rights, it talks about 7 rights which the consumers should have. The first is the individual control over what personal data companies collect and how they use it, related to the current principles of consent, notice, and choice. And second, transparency through easily understandable and as a current principle known as access and correction. And sixth is focused collection, that is reasonable limits on the personal data that companies collect and retain, which is collection limitation. And finally, accountability. Now accountability, as I said, as a principle is evolving. Europe also wants it, and the US also wants it. That is, data controllers should be accountable for its actions. But do the actions mean that simply by giving the notice, you put it as the responsibility of the consumer or the citizen who doesn't understand the implications, who can be denied of the services? So this part is something which is now being debated to expand the accountability principle. I'm sure you have heard about privacy by default, privacy by design. So all these concepts, I won't call them principles, they could be included as privacy, as part of the accountability principle. So data controller being made accountable by ensuring that they imbibe these concepts and free the individual from being concerned about so much through notice and choice, take on the responsibility themselves. So likewise, OECD is also debating, APEC is also underway. But I think, as you can see, while the international instruments of privacy are different, there's a acceptance around privacy principles, something that we are also debating in our own committee, that if we can agree upon a framework of privacy principles and then try to see how to enforce it. So that is a key point. But should these instruments, by that I mean the laws, should they be consistent? That is a key point. Or should the implementation be left to individual governments, the way sovereign parliaments act, the way there's a culture in every country about the laws and how they are made? So that part is something which, if there is enforcement from any quarters, whether European Union trying to see that India has a law, Mauritius has a law which is similar to what EU desires or requires, that is something which is going to be difficult. We cannot have harmonization of laws. We can have harmonization of principles, but enforcement will be different and based on our own cultural patterns. So the privacy principles is something which we as a committee are debating. There are some of them which we have agreed upon. I will not delve into the detail, but they are all around accountability, notice, choice, and so on. But the key point which we are debating in our own country is that this should be enforceable. How do you enforce it? There are enforcement ways, and again models are there, how US enforces through FTC, and how EU does it through data protection commissioners, privacy authorities, or information commissioners. UK has a different model where they would like to believe that the RTI commissioner and privacy commissioner can be all gelled into one. So there are different ways, and we will have to debate on how we do. And the government's group is now debating on these principles, enforcement methods, and also the role of self-regulation. Because if you start with a single privacy commissioner in a country, I think the basic role for the next few years is going to be education and awareness, rights to the people about privacy. If you look at, as a parallel, the Consumer Protection Act, it first came into being in 1986, and it is now 26 years, and you will still hear commercials on the radio if you listen to AIR FM, and you will see there commercials coming about consumers' rights. And implementation of consumer rights is still not there, it is lacking. So if you talk about privacy and fairness in terms of privacy, India is still a long way, and the projects which are coming into being now, which are going to have a bearing on the privacy of individuals, so they will require massive education. And this education cannot be carried out by a single privacy commissioner or a privacy commission in Delhi. It has to be sectoral. It can be done only through self-regulatory units such as DSCI set up in the verticals, like banking to have a similar vertical, insurance to have another vertical, telecom to have another vertical with their own people promoting this concept, like DSCI is trying to do in the IT BPO companies. So I think we are trying to see that the role of self-regulation is important, while the privacy bill should also recognize that data has economic value and that global data flows generate value for individual as well as for businesses. And we as a country, which is a BPO hub, and we would like to continue that way. So we have to have principles which are in line with what the expectations of our global consumers or clients are. So the recommendation is going to be, it should be a light touch regulation with minimum bureaucracy that inspires trust of users in protection of their privacy, irrespective of whether data is captured by the government agencies for projects like UID, NatGrid, or by the private sector in the conduct of providing services to their consumers, for example, banks and telecom providers. So I think we are on the right track, and I cannot say how long will it take. So maybe the next conference we will have Justice Shah actually coming and talking about these a little more in detail and giving a legal jurisprudence perspective, which I have tried to refrain from. Maybe Sunil will comment later during the discussions part. Thank you very much for your patient listening.